With Karyn Maughan, who is the Tiso Black Star senior journalist who's been covering these matters for a number of years now. She joins us on the line. And Karyn, good evening to you. I mean, you could start off by saying that this was a bit of a victory for the former president, was it not?
Well, bearing in mind that the opposition parties in this case, including the EFF, UDM, COPE, and the DA, were all opposed to him actually being granted this right to intervene in his personal capacity, it was somewhat of a victory. I mean, of all of those parties arguing that it was simply not good enough for the former president just 2 months ago seeking to bring this application to intervene in his personal capacity, that he'd had ample time and opportunity to do it before, and this was simply yet another manifestation of his delaying Stalingrad tactics. However, the court not necessarily buying into that argument and giving a very brief ruling, effectively saying that he would be granted this right to intervene in the proceedings, and it would explain its decision later on.
Now, just to set the context straight here, as I understand it, Karyn, of course, Zuma had brought the review application and interdict in his capacity as president and appealed the cost order in that capacity as well. But the withdrawal by his successor, President Cyril Ramaphosa, of that application in April is really what threw a spanner in the works, is it not?
Absolutely, that's a perfect assessment of what happened. But one cannot get away from the fact that, this is the first time in South African history that a court of law has ever made a personal cost order against a sitting head of state or a head of state. We never saw such things happening in the courts during apartheid, and we certainly haven't seen it happening in democracy. So Jacob Zuma creating his, as he often does, peculiar kind of legal history. Now, that cost order is looking at an estimated 10 million rand that the former president would have to fork out of his own pocket. So one can imagine that this would be quite an extraordinary thing were it to be confirmed by other courts, if indeed this leave to appeal application is granted, and he fails in that appeal. And of course, the big question would be, where would he get the money? Jacob Zuma will be in court in November to continue to fight for continued legal funding of his corruption trial case. And, he also faces the prospect of other litigation flowing out of that case. He wants to bring a permanent stay at prosecution. So this issue of legal fees and the state's willingness to pay them or not pay them, and the court's decision to personally grant a cost order against the president in his personal capacity, all putting a lot of financial weight on Jacob Zuma's future litigation strategy.
Now, of course, former President Zuma still maintains that he'd opposed the public protector's report on principle. It becomes a little confusing, though, when you consider that at the last hour, his withdrawal would seem to have contradicted that.
Yes, remember there's two cases that are at issue here. Of course, the first one was his aborted attempt to interdict the release of the public protector's state of capture report, which he abandoned, and then his subsequent attempt to review that report on the grounds that Chidi Madonsela had said, because of Jacob Zuma's level of conflict in this matter, because he was so heavily implicated in her report, it would not be appropriate for him to be the person to choose the judge who would preside over the state capture inquiry, and that instead it would be Chief Justice Mogoeng, who would be the right person to make that decision. Now, one of these issues, this issue of implication, is quite pivotal to the arguments that have been made by, amongst other people, CASAC and the opposition parties. They're saying you can't come to this court and simply argue that you're doing this, as your lawyers have argued, to kind of make sure that this inquiry is constitutionally appropriate and safe and it doesn't face any legal challenge. You can't pretend that you're not heavily implicated in this. And as Dali and Mpofu for the UDM and COPE argued, the effect of what the former president did in seeking to challenge this report effectively delayed a process that could have begun in November 2015 from going ahead, that it was delayed for quite some time before it could finally go ahead now this year. And what is the impact of that? Recklessness, as he put it, on ordinary South Africans. And in light of that recklessness, of course, the opposition party is arguing that this personal cost order was more than justified and that the former president should pay that money himself.
Well, let's move forward now to what we've been hearing in terms of what's been coming out of the state, the commission rather, into state capture. I mean, we've heard some pretty startling revelations in recent days, Karyn. The idea that the ANC was saying that attacking the Guptas was attacking black business in this country. What have you made of what we've heard this week, particularly, of course, from the likes of Standard Bank, a number of bank leaders saying they've been summoned to Luthuli House to explain the closure of Gupta accounts?
You know, it's going to be fascinating to see what the commission does and whether the members of NEC who were on the version of officials, and we certainly have no reason to at point to believe that they were lying about this, why they would have felt it appropriate as the ruling party to take this extraordinary step to engage with banks about private confidential client relationships, and then seek to interrogate them on the version of at least two of the witnesses that have testified about whether they were, quote unquote, receiving orders from Stellenbosch, whether they had altogether as private institutions colluded against the Guptas, and whether they were effectively part of the so-called white monopoly capital regime that was intent on undermining black business. Now, we know that, for instance, Enoch Godongwana on Twitter making it very clear that he is ready and willing to take this commission into his confidence about what exactly happened there and what informed those ANC meetings. We know that the commission hasn't notified any of those ANC officials that they are in fact implicated in wrongdoing in terms of what happened. But they have served such a notice of implication on the former Mineral Resources Minister, Mosebenzi Zwane. And one would argue that manifestly the evidence against him about allegations in fact threatened certain banks and made veiled threats about banks being dependent on government for their banking licenses. And at one point, according to Nedbank CEO Michael Brown, actually made a direct appeal to Nedbank to, quote unquote, step in and save jobs by taking over Gupta accounts because the Gupta the family members had resigned from those accounts. Those kind of issues clearly require answers from Mosebenzi Zwane. This is an individual who is at the heart of several quite damning allegations about the Estenia Dairy Project alleged scam, who has reportedly, according to the Gupta leaks, got private flights for his gospel choir sponsored by the Gupta family to India, and certainly is mired in controversy in terms of his involvement in the whole Tegeta Optimum coal mine deal, in which he is said to have personally flown to Switzerland to facilitate that particular deal. So at this point, I spoke to Mosebenzi Zwane last night, him not willing to say whether he'll apply to cross-examine witnesses or even at this point, Bongani, to respond to the allegations against him, simply saying that at this point he has, quote-unquote, made enough news.
Yes, indeed, saying that he would keep his views to himself, as what's been reported. Now, somebody who also hasn't made any efforts to come forward with a version is former Minister Lynn Brown, who was told today, well, you can't have your cake and eat it. If you're going to not be willing to offer a version, you're not going to be allowed to cross-examine witnesses.
Well, it was quite interesting that she brought that cross-examination application in the first place, bearing in mind that the sole basis at this point for her bringing it, according to the evidence that we've heard led so far, was Mkhabisi Jonas saying that a Gupta brother, whether it was RJ or Rajesh, said to him that the family, quote-unquote, looked after former Eskom CEO Brian Molefe and Lynn Brown. That was really the only statement that was made about Lynn Brown. And from speaking to a lot of the inquiry, legal team, they did not at that point feel that she was implicated. So for her at now, this point, to bring an application just to cross-examine on this one point and not being willing to really take the commission into her confidence and really come forward with a full version of what exactly happened in terms of her relationship with their family was, I think, legally not the best strategy going forward. And we know that, in all likelihood, as this matter proceeds, there will be further evidence against her, and she may well want to reconsider invitation, or can be received as one, by Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, for her to come forward and really give her side of the story as to these multiple allegations that various SOEs were mired in state capture corruption, and that as the minister in charge of those organizations, she should have had some ability to understand what was going on in terms of that alleged capture.
Now, Karyn, of course, interestingly, a developing story later in the day today, RJ Gupta coming out strongly denying the assertions that have been made repeatedly by the former Deputy Finance Minister, Mcebisi Jonas, saying, in fact, he wasn't even in Saxonwold on the day in which the former Deputy Minister alleges he was offered the position of Finance Minister.
Well, this wasn't a big shock. Remember, of course, we saw Mcebisi Jonas during his evidence actually saying that he wasn't certain which Gupta brother he had met with, that he had been for a very long time fairly certain that it was RJ Gupta, but he couldn't discount the possibility that it was in fact Rajesh. Well, now in a 6-page affidavit, we see RJ Gupta again, as he did in the Pretoria High Court, very strongly denying in any terms that he has ever, in fact, met with Mcebisi Jonas, and also having quite a go at former Public Protector Thuli Madonsela, saying that he believes that he was identified as this person, of course denying that any such meeting had actually taken place, because Thuli Madonsela put a photograph or photographs in front of Mcebisi Jonas and basically asked him, quote unquote, leading questions to make sure that he identified this person that he allegedly met with as RJ Gupta. Of course, denying very much that, there was any meeting, any such offer, and actually saying in as many words that Mcebisi Jonas is lying and that what he has said is simply a blatant fabrication. Now, what this is going to do, of course, is to put a huge amount of weight on Judas Zuma, the former president's son, and Fana Hlongwane, that controversial arms deal advisor, who were on the version of Jonas in that meeting and witnessed this alleged bribe offer and the subsequent threats, to come forward and really bat for the Gupta side in denying that this meeting actually played out in the way that it did. And from what we know from previous court proceedings and other statements that have been in other matters of litigation, that is very much what is going to happen. We know that Judas Zuma and Fana Hlongwane are going to deny that there was any meeting with a Gupta, with any Gupta family members, that a Gupta family member walked into their meeting with Mcebisi Jonas, and they're going to say that meeting was about Mcebisi Jonas making so-called false allegations that Fana Hlongwane was trying to blackmail him.
Well, Karyn, as we wrap up our conversation, we also saw later in the day the leader of the economic freedom fighters, Judas Molefe, addressing supporters outside the North Gauteng High Court. What was his reaction to the developments of the day?
Well, essentially, he'd been there to bring a challenge against the Riotous Assemblies Act, which is 1956 legislation, which underpins the criminal case against him for inciting unlawful occupation of land. But that case had been postponed because he hadn't filed certain necessary constitutional notices, because his case is a constitutional challenge. He then sat with Musi Maimane at one stage in former President Jacob Zuma's legal fees challenge around the state capture costs, and then proceeded to give quite an emotive address outside the court in which he accused Cyril Ramaphosa of being controlled by Pravin Gordhan, said Pravin Gordhan was an agent of white monopoly capital, and also made multiple allegations about Gordhan's receiving orders from Stellenbosch. He also commented on the Sunday Times report of that so-called plot meeting, and very much said that if people were plotting to remove Ramaphosa, or former President Zuma and his cohorts were doing such a thing, they would be very welcome to do so, because this was a democracy and such things were possible in a democracy, and to speak of plots was simply not appropriate. So quite a long address to his supporters. There weren't many of them. I would say at least maybe 200 at most, but going into a lot of detail about how he believes that Pravin Gordhan is the real agent of so-called white monopoly capital in South Africa.
All right, Karyn Maughan, we'll have to leave it there with you. Thank you so much for your analysis and giving context to all those legal stories that have been developing throughout the day. Of course, Karyn Maughan is the senior legal journalist with Tiso Black Star, giving us some context there. And as we look forward in the coming weeks to the next list of witnesses that are going to be coming forward in the state capture matter, you can look forward to testimony by the likes of Nhlanhla, the Finance Minister, Pravin Gordhan himself, Minister of Public Enterprises, and of course the former Minister of Public Enterprises, Barbara Hogan. Right, so